And Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is speaking at the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit. Let's cut across to that.
Than what anyone expected. PMI figures are still in expansion territory, which coming off the record highs that they were indicates that the mood remains optimistic. There are a lot of other high-frequency indicators like auto sales that continue to do well. So I want to ask you, how do you feel about the economy right now? Do you think we are in a better place than we were 3-4 months ago?
Good evening to Sumar and to everybody else who are watching this. You line up a lot of eminent guests, and the conversation is very pithy and leads to a lot of thinking in the policy circles. And therefore, it's always a pleasure to be here because it both gives you ideas and also gives you a platform to be able to convey your thoughts about my feeling on the economy. We are certainly in a different environment now compared to when I had given the budget. Budget time environment was itself different from what it was in July 2019. But unfortunately, post the budget in February 2020, not just India, globally, you saw unexplainable challenges, which every finance minister was facing with grit, trying to do the maximum best for their own economies. We did have what I would call a judicious mixture of fiscal and monetary, and to about 10% of the GDP is what we could extend till now. As I say always, I keep my mind open, keep the options open for intervention every time. But now I think we are getting too close to the budget. It's certainly now looking up in terms of recovery. I never would want to get into any of these alphabet jugglery, whether it is B, whether it is K, whether it is anything else. But every sector is showing clear indication that by some very pessimistic observers, recovery is there. Some would say patchy, but never mind. Recovery is consistently happening over the last 2 months.
A quick follow-up to that. There is a feeling in some quarters that much of what we are seeing is pent-up demand, which is coming into the market. Much of what we are seeing is festive demand. And now that the festive season is over and the pent-up demand is more or less extinguished, you will begin to see things starting to slow down again. What's your own view on this?
I'm not sure if just the pent-up demand and the festival demand will explain consistent more than 1 lakh collection in GST for 2 months. Yes, normally this is the season when festival demand always adds a bit more fervor to the demand which prevails through in a year. But I also see reports, and I'm also talking to many industry leaders who are looking at capacity expansion. Like, for instance, you hear core sector industries, be it cement, be it iron and steel, integrated plants, which have had a certain level of capacity, are all going in for expansion. More, investment towards expanding capacity, not just in one unit, but across the country, you're hearing of expansion. If that is the case, which also, in a way, gets reflected. Expansion of capacity is one thing, and the prevailing demand has got itself indicated in the PMI manufacturing and also PMI in service. It is an indication that additional demand is what is coming in. And therefore, I think this is not something which is a pent-up or festival-driven demand. It is likely to sustain.
One of the things that we've noticed is that private investment is still weak. It's not picked up. And that puts a lot of pressure on the government to sort of boost the economy by spending more. Do you think that we have enough fiscal room to expand this?
But I would slightly question that assumption. And that is why I think it is important for us to recognize that many of the big industries who are in the core sectors are announcing expansion plans. That's not going to happen without additional investment coming from their side. And it's also getting reflected in the fact that banks are also seeing industry approach for additional expansion related funding requests. So I think that assumption may have held true in October, maybe not now. You are seeing expansion in capacities, and therefore that cannot be without investment from private sector.
It's still not shown up in credit though. But if what you're saying holds, then it will shortly show up.
That's right. We may have to wait for our assumption to be revetted with these two data to come. One thing is very clear, announcements by industry, but we can also wait for a month and see if credit is also equally expanding in those lines.
The RBI announced its monetary policy today, and as expected, there was no change. Clearly, the Reserve Bank is worried about inflation. I have two questions, so I'm going to break them up. How worried are you about inflation?
I'm actually not worried about inflation to the extent that there are seasonal ups and downs in prices, and the commodities about which we are seeing clear hike in their prices are largely seasonal. If you take the food grains and food edible commodities such as fruits and vegetables, also look at edible oils, there are seasonal fluctuations. And I'm also happy that the government through the interministerial group has been very frequently looking at the changes and taking conscious call to fill in any supply level shortages through imports, and also to make sure any logistical constraints which are adding to the supply difficulties are all getting sorted out. So with the intervention from the government periodically to meet any shortages in supply, I have a feeling this blip in the inflation, particularly of food items, will ease out. And therefore, I don't see this inflation, particularly on food items, continuing where it is. It will have to come down.
With RBI's lack of action today, the fact that it left things unchanged, does that put sort of, I know there is a certain secrecy that shrouds the entire budget making process, so I'm not going to ask you for specifics, but does it sort of put more pressure on you to do a far more growth-oriented budget? Because, you know, if RBI had cut rates, it would have helped a little bit. But now your much of your budget is going to be set in a context where inflation is high. While what you're saying is true, a lot of it is food inflation, which will probably come down. And RBI has not taken any rate action. So does it put more pressure on you to deliver a more growth-oriented budget?
Well, I think it's always a careful balance between what the RBI does, taking into consideration monetary issues, and what we need to do even otherwise. I think the fiscal responsibility in terms of looking at ways in which stimulus can be provided, particularly at a time like this, will have to take definite importance. So there's no game saying that now that RBI, and therefore it doesn't work that way. I think continuously it's a real-time balance that both RBI and the finance ministry will have to do. At no point in time any one would be left to deal it the way they want. It has to be a delicate, well-studied balance, particularly at a time when we are looking at reviving the economy at the earliest possible and giving it that momentum and sustaining that momentum. So these are not small black and white situations. They are issues where a lot of calibration and coordination with RBI will have to be worked out, and we are continuously doing that.
Again, while I told you that I wouldn't get into the specifics, this is a question which is on top of everyone's mind. When next year's budget numbers are presented, one of the first things that everyone is going to look for is for the expenditure on the vaccine, because everyone is focused on that one thing, right? I mean, over the last 8 months, many of us have spoken of nothing but COVID and how it has changed things. Are you making a huge allowance for the vaccine in your budget?
At the moment, I can't even respond to it, only because, not because I'm talking about issues which will come in the budget, but matter of fact, as of today, we do not know what will be the details which come with the vaccine. Is it going to be 1 dose or 2 doses? Is it going to be 2 doses spaced, let us say, 3 weeks, 4 weeks in between, first dose and second dose? Are 2 doses going to be sufficient? Or is there a recurrent dose which had to be given after 6 months? Unless we get all these details, as much as how much is per dose going to cost, I really cannot even work towards a number. So about the vaccine itself, whichever gets cleared, and once it is cleared, I need to know cost per dose. I also need to know what will be the cycle in which, is it going to be one time, lifetime, or is it going to be 2 doses but repetitive? All these will have to be, worked out, and only then can I even think of a number.
Okay. Let's move to another area which has got a lot of media coverage over the last few months, which is GST. And I think the issue is by and large resolved, with most of the states signing in. I think there's just one state which is holding out. Jharkhand is probably the only state which is yet to sign. And I'm going to ask a hypothetical question, which is, in hindsight, do you think the promise of 14% growth in state taxes, which was something that encouraged states to sign up, was always bound to run into trouble?
That we've, fallen short of collecting enough compensation. If economy as viewed in 16-17 had continued, this question wouldn't even be relevant. We are talking of 2 extraordinary years after the launch of GST. Immediately after that, all right. The 1 or 2 years went on all right. But the next 2 years, meaning the 3rd and the 4th year, were extraordinary years, and not just the center, but states have also had various kinds of difficulties. And also, if you look at it, other than the COVID, other than economy slowing, issue of how frequently would you consider rate reduction or rate increase? Ideally, I've been, in a way, requesting that the council, if anything, should take a call that it doesn't, in every one of its sitting, it doesn't decide to change rates, because change it to go up or change it to bring it down, it actually upsets the calculation of your revenue generation. As a result, states or the center planning saying that this year they would expect to have so much come from the GST are made to calculate and recalculate every 3 months after a GST council meeting. So if, like in the budget, taxation related issues, particularly rates, can be dealt with, accumulate it over the year and decide on it once, so that at least the next 12 months can go on a predictable course. So these are things which are germane to the fact of revenue generation and compensation collection. I'm sure the council wouldn't hesitate to discuss and understand and take a call on this matter.
This whole episode of GST, because it, like a lot of other issues, it got very, very politicized. What has it done to the GST Council itself? Because the GST Council it emerged as this uh, symbol of all that was good and great with India's federal structure. Is there some fraying that's happened? Is it a little strange right now, or do you think things will get back to normal?
No, I would like you to repeat that sentence which you said. It is one of the best things for the Indian federal system. I think it's a very robust mechanism, and I truly appreciate every finance minister who come to represent their states for keeping that spirit up. There could be a lot of discussion. Some views may be different from the other views, but to be fair, everyone has spoken from the point of view of concerns freely being expressed and from the point of view of finding a solution. There has never been that kind of a bitterness which sometimes get captured outside, but not truly in the council. I still think the compensation cess related discussions taken on board, I would still say it is one of the best things for the Indian federal system, federal structure. There is a lot of engagement between center and state, very real-time engagement, and a lot of learning to take away from each GST council. And I good statesmen. So I fully appreciate the GST Council's vibrancy.
Coming to Reserve Bank of India again, one of their internal working groups put out a recommendation which said corporate promoted banks should be allowed. It's promoted a furious debate. I'm happy at one level because our editorial pages have had a series of very, very interesting columns with people arguing both for and against it, and some very interesting facets have come up. I know it's an RBI internal paper. Do you have a view on this?
Well, that it is an RBI internal paper. RBI itself probably has not taken a position, but these are not issues which are being discussed for the first time. The non-operative holding company idea has been long in the I wouldn't say works, it's been also taken on board. Subsequently, some NBFCs have been given banking permission. After all, one or two banks, I don't want to take any bank's name, private sector, NBFC, becoming banks, licensed, were all done during the last, let's say, 10 years. In the last 10 years, you've had private banks coming up. So these are not new discussions. These are not discussions which are happening only now. These are discussions not happening just under this governor. These are discussions which have happened under earlier governors also. And these are discussions which happened, and also decisions have been taken on it, based on it even earlier. So from my side, well, this is not the first time, and this is not a new idea. NBFCs in this country have been given, permission to become banks.
Agriculture reforms. When they came out, again, there was debate about it. But by and large, I think the reception was positive. Because Indian agriculture is one of those areas which has needed reform for a long period of time. But the scale of protests, have they come as a surprise to you?
Well, one thing is clear. Under Prime Minister Modi, a lot of homework happens much before anything is taken as a final call. Consultations happen, consultations at various levels happen. I know the ministry, Agriculture Ministry and Farmers Welfare have gone through the process of talking to a lot of stakeholders, and only after that. And after all, these are things which have been in the discussion for a very long time. Political parties had put all these things in their election manifesto. Every party, in fact, had spoken about it. Maybe if you leave aside one or two which had questions about it, parties which are probably largely not in a big way represented in the Lok Sabha. But however, national parties, state level parties have all mentioned it at different times that these are reforms which are long awaited. Many parliamentary committees have also discussed some aspects. One has discussed on some and some others have discussed on some others. So it's not something which was just done in a jiffy. They've gone through the grind for quite some time, and these were of several parties. Well, if there are farmers who have some doubts and who would want to speak about it, I'm glad Agriculture Minister is sitting and engaging in meaningful conversation with them with an open mind. I'm sure something will come out of it.
There is been a strong demand from the farmers' side on writing MSP into a law. And from the economic point of view, the perils are very clear to some of us. It's potentially inflationary. Do you think that is an option that is off the table, or do you think the government could even consider doing that?
The negotiations are going on, so I'm not sure it will be good for me to comment on it at all, because MSP is something which, one thing for sure, between 2014 and 20, compared to a similar number of years previously, we have proven that we take MSP seriously. We procure under MSP much more than what the earlier governments have done. We've allotted and also directly given the farmers a lot more money under MSP than what was done before, paddy or wheat. Remember the speech which Prime Minister gave launching some of the infrastructure projects in his constituency in Kashi, only last week, I think, elaborates on how MSP has been used by this government to the benefit of the farmers. More money, more crop being procured only proves the intention of this government has been that MSP continues, APMCs continue, so doubts on those score need not be there.
One of the concerns that I think farmers have is from increasing corporate involvement. I personally think there is a lot of distrust that they have. How do you reconcile the roles of the state and the role of the market in agriculture? I think there's a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed there.
Fundamental problem, if you were to look at it, as the government should not be addressing it at all. But it is not a problem if you say government has to address issues related to very small holding farmers who will have to have the negotiating strength, and therefore the MSP comes up as a big support for them. They are at least sure that somewhere, someplace, they can at least sell their product for a certain minimum price. And that minimum support price is not decided by the whims and fancies of anybody. There is a committee on agriculture costs and prices. They taking the feedback from the ground, then decide on the costing, and then figures are arrived at. So I think there is no elementary contradiction between the corporate and the private, and the government intervention here, but the government intervention is so very important only to give that assurance for small farmers who will otherwise not have a buyer.
We've got a lot of audience questions. Some of them obviously want you to make predictions, so I think I will filter those questions out. But before I get to the questions from the people who are watching, why have you not pushed ahead with a more universal income transfer scheme? Because there's been one for farmers. Migrants haven't got an income transfer, but some sections. If you remember, the first relief package that you offered for people with Jandan accounts, for women, there was a cash transfer that was made. But you have not. Actually, I would go as far to say that there's been some hesitation in pushing ahead with that. Do you think you should have done that? Because a financial cushion through transfers will also boost demand. And one of the things that everyone wants at this time is more demand.
Yes, to have more demand is the need of the hour, well taken. But like so many different ideas which come speaking about how government effectively can put money in the hands of people, particularly the poor, there are so many different formulations which come. And we've heard many of them. And during the pandemic, it was thought, because I think the rough figure, subject to correction, about 30 crore people received cash transfers during that time. And that has been of, some help to them, maybe not sufficient, but some help. But the idea that you're saying as to why didn't you do it that way as a universal transfer of income is like the way many other suggestions have also come. I've not considered some of them. I didn't consider this. We'll have to see how best we can deal with this demand stimulus.
This is a question I've asked you every time we've met. How worried are you about the fiscal deficit? Because it's one number that many of the rating agencies look at, and it's usually a number that finance ministers are very worried about. Does this bother you?
I think fiscal deficit, I've had people tell me, forget the number, print notes. I've also had in the other extreme people tell me, yes, you may want to do spending, but it has to be with some kind of a multiplier effect. So please concentrate on just spending on capital expenditure. So yes, two extreme views have come, and spending on capital expenditure is not an extreme view to that sense because it has great multiplier effect. I'm not saying I'm taking that route only, but then the fact remains, this year, whether you go to this one extreme or whether you remain too very prudent, the fiscal deficit number is not what was said in the budget of February 2020. It is certainly going to be away from it. It's certainly going to be higher than that.
Which is true, right? I mean, you presented your budget in a world that was entirely different. I mean, it wasn't just in India which was different, but it was a world that was entirely different. I'm going to ask some questions from viewers. One of them asks a question that you've answered to some extent, but I'm going to ask you because it's a question that keeps coming up again and again, saying that while you announced a program, some of the measures that of India's fiscal stimulus were long-term in nature and didn't really involve cash in hand for the middle class, which I think is it's a big problem for the middle class. Right? And the viewer asks, what were the reasons for this relative parsimony?
No, I can't. Medium and long term cannot be linked with anything. They have to be done irrespective of the fact that today we are in a pandemic situation or not. Those are medium and long-term steps will have to be taken, because if you give this excuse, now you're in a pandemic situation, so necessary structural reforms need not be undertaken, even that will not be right. And the will of the Prime Minister has always been that reforms should be a continuous process. I shouldn't halt it. In fact, the pandemic coming as a challenge should also be converted into an opportunity, and therefore we will go ahead with reforms is one thing. To link that with you've done that but you've not done anything for the middle class is also not right. So first of all, segregate the two. But even otherwise, I want to ask this question saying, if I've given incentives for people to, get interest subvention, does that not reach the middle class? If I've said that you can defer the payment in terms of GST or your income tax compliance and regulation related relaxations, which we've done now, are they not going to benefit the middle class? Interest on interest, wherein in the court I have gone to say, no, we shall pay up the interest on interest, it shall not be a burden on people, whether it is a credit card based money, whether it is anything that you bought, whether it is your regular EMI. These are benefits which are being given. Interest on interest is being paid by the government. Does that not reach the middle class? So I can go on like this. The EPFO money, of course, it's their own money, but we've completely relaxed that regulation and said, you may want to take that money now because you need money in your hand. That relaxation was done. And that's not for the middle class, is it? And again, now in the current one, I have said that even people who have been thrown out of jobs should be taken back, or they should be enrolled. If they are enrolled, the government will pay their PF for both the employer and the employee's contribution for the next 2 years. Is that not going to help the middle class? So I think if you want to put all these things which are spread over and across into the basket of middle class, you honestly will get something. May not be adequate enough to say, oh, I've given as much as they've asked, maybe not, but I have included. And it's only scattered across the board over different headings. And therefore to say that, no, you've not done it altogether, I want all this to be put into the